welcome to Fast Politics, David.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So you and I are like absolutely on the same page today. We both wrote our columns. You wrote your column in The Guardian. I wrote my column in Vanity Fair about exactly the same thing, which is where I think the smart money is in the Democratic Party right now. So I, I want you to explain to our listeners why you think that Trump's tariffs are a winner for Dems.
I think they're a winner for a particular kind of Dem. I think obviously the tariffs creating chaos for the economy is bad for the incumbent party
Right.
and probably structurally, I guess, politically good for
Yeah.
the opposition party. I mean, I think it's bad for really
It's bad for
everybody. Yeah,
everybody. Yeah,
unless you're a
yeah, I mean,
billionaire. But
right, and
but
even then, you
yeah, I'm
have to
not
be
sure
the
it's great
right
for a
kind
lot
of
of the, yeah.
billionaire, yeah.
Good point. So I think there's a way for Democrats to be criticizing the kinds of tariffs, the kinds of trade policies Trump is putting into effect. There's a very strong argument that they're so broad, they're so inconsistent, they're so sort of haphazard. There's no indication to suggest they're going to achieve anything that Trump says they are, right? If you're trying to reshore American jobs that have been offshored, uh, for example, you probably want to put in tariffs that have a timetable for implementation to give
Mhm.
industries a chance to rebuild and make capital investments, rebuild factories in the United States. That really hasn't happened. If you want to get companies to make giant capital investments in the United States, you probably want to show that the policies you're putting into place are permanent and stable
Yes,
rather than
yes,
waking up every 6 hours and saying, oh,
yeah,
we're going to do this exemption or that exemption. How is any business supposed to invest in that? So the point is that the Democrats have a really good argument to make that these tariffs are going to harm the working
right,
class and America in general. Now, one caveat. I think if the Democrats take that to its extreme and say all industrial policy, all tariffs are bad, that the NAFTA trade paradigm and the China free trade paradigm, all of that is good, then I think they walk into a trap that Trump wants them to walk
mhm.
into. And I think there's evidence that parts of the party don't really understand the trap that Trump is trying to lay for them.
First, I wanna just go back to what you were saying. 70% of Americans believe that tariffs are gonna be bad for the economy on the short term. You don't get 70% of Americans to agree on anything. Those are incredible numbers, and I think that that should be sort of the foundation of all of this, but the thing that I think will likely do the best for the opposition party, which Democrats need to be, is the haphazardness and the way that none of this has been thought out, which is what we right. So, like, for example, and I want to get into this. The reshoring manufacturing is like one of the goals here, right? Reshoring manufacturing, but you can't reshore manufacturing just by making things more expensive. Chips and Science had a goal of reshoring manufacturing, really, like reshoring these high-paying manufacturing jobs, which are chips. A chips assembly line is a much better job than a sneakers assembly line, and that was the thinking here. But because they could not articulate it, it got lost. And so now here we have Trump trying to do the same thing, but because there's never any sort of thinking behind anything, we're here instead.
That's a really good point. The Biden administration, it got the policy actually right.
Right.
That Biden used targeted tariffs on specific industries as part of a coordinated industrial policy. For instance, the CHIPS Act, as you mentioned, which invests, actually uses money, resources to invest. The Inflation Reduction Act, which uses tax credits and other investment tools, along with targeted tariffs. And we saw manufacturing jobs start to come back in the United States and factory investments start to be made. By the way, many of which were made in red states, in
Right.
Republican states. The problem was, as you allude to, the Biden administration never sold it. They never made it part of their political pitch to the country. Kamala Harris didn't, the Democratic Party didn't. And now you have a situation where Trump is trying to take the political themes
Right.
of reshoring American jobs, brand it to himself, but with a completely unacceptable, reckless, and haphazard policy. And again, I think the Democrats have a story to tell about how the haphazardness of Trump's policy is imperiling the country. But I think they could make a political mistake by allowing Trump to brand them once again, as he did in 2016, to brand them as the party of NAFTA style trade policy, right? I think this has been forgotten. There are large swaths of this country that used to be Democratic regions, Democratic strongholds, that were hollowed out by so-called free trade deals, NAFTA, China, PNTR. And I think that is a very real issue. That is a very authentic concern for those communities that went through that and that continue to go through that. And I think if the Democrats sort of scoff at that
Right.
grievance, they play into what Trump wants them to do. And here's the other polling number that I think has been forgotten, that while the public is opposed to Trump's tariff policy on the actual policy merits, for the first time in generations, at the same time, the Republicans have evened the playing field on the question of who cares about you. That question in
Right.
polling, who most cares about you? For the first time, really in modern polling history, the Republican Party has now pulled even with Democrats. So my theory here is, and I would speculate that what's going on here is that large majorities of the country are like, hey, Trump is not managing the economy right. He doesn't know what he's doing with these tariffs. These tariffs are going to be bad for me. On the policy, it's clear. But hey, he's also talking about this issue, trade and tariffs and reshoring jobs and what happened to America. And so even if we don't think he's right on the policy, he's at least talking about this issue that very few politicians have wanted to talk about, which shows, or the perception is that he's on our side. And I think that's the dichotomy that we're in. Obviously, I don't think he's on our side, but my
Right.
point is that that's the tension here.
Again, setting a trap. Maybe Trump's people are setting a trap, but Trump himself, right, has always loved tariffs. They're a very sort of simple idea that he gets, right? But the problem is the unpredictability that the world has now seen is, I think, more detrimental than the tariffs even, right? Because if you knew there were tariffs coming, you could plan for them, and you'd move your manufacturing to the United States to get around the tariffs, and you'd import here and export there. I mean, there are a million ways that people have gotten around tariffs. What happened, I think, is that it really looked like Trump was going to just do really crazy stuff, right? We'd had just days and days and days of the market cratering. And then he pulled back, but then, we've now seen on the Sunday shows, we saw Latinx saying, well, no, we're doing more. I think the unpredictability is responsible for the perhaps and hopefully not, but likely recession that is to follow.
I absolutely agree that the old adage applies here. Businesses crave, above all else, stability, predictability. The inconsistency has done just as much damage as the proposal for tariffs themselves. Absolutely. But I go back to the politics here. That I'll put it in another way. Trump sees a trade war as an extension of his culture war. It's not a trade policy as economic policy. It's trade policy
It's
as a
political.
culture war, a political
Yeah.
culture war. I'm trying to reshore jobs. Democrats are saying that the old NAFTA China free trade model is great. I am on your side. And I think the ultimate contest is going to be how much economic pain is the working class willing to tolerate in linked to the idea that, hey, at least he's supposedly on our side, right? My view is that there'll be so much economic pain that even if lots of people perceive, hey, Trump's at least talking about this issue, Trump wants to do something about unfair trade, that the pain itself is going potentially and unfortunately to be so great that it will ultimately not help Trump. But
Yeah.
again, I go back to like Democrats have a careful balance to strike here,
Right.
to my mind, and I think they should look to their members of Congress, by the way, in these working class swing districts that Trump has competed in, right? Like Chris Deluzio, the congressman from Western Pennsylvania, he has said, listen, Trump's application of tariffs are haphazard, reckless, bad,
Right.
but we should not be saying all tariffs are bad. My community out here in Western Pennsylvania was gutted by NAFTA.
Right.
That's a smart way to talk about this stuff.
Right. And that's why you saw, and it didn't work out for her, but that's why you saw Gretchen
Right,
Whitmer
right.
at the White House, was that very same thing.
Absolutely. Whitmer was trying to find the same balance. And I just hope that the Democrats don't revert to saying, hey, NAFTA, China, all free trade is great. And I should add, there are powerful forces inside of the Democratic Party that want to polarize this debate in that way. Powerful corporate forces that want to
Right.
say, hey, this proves that all tariffs are bad, tariff-free trade that lets corporations exploit workers across the globe, put Americans into competition with workers who make $1 a day and no environmental regulations.
Right.
That's what we should want. And that's a powerful faction in the Democratic Party. But the hope is that there's another faction in the Democratic Party that says that, hey, the politics of that were wrong. And the thing is that all they have to do is cite the most recent Democratic Party president and the
Right.
record on manufacturing to say, hey, this was working and Trump
Yeah.
broke it.
Yeah. Like, I think you're right about the Democratic messaging on this and the importance of not throwing the tariff baby out with the bathwater. That said, a lot of people really did believe the lie that Trump was going to be good for the economy.
Right, right.
And this is a definitive bit of data. This is not Democrats. This is not, there's no one else to blame for this but Trump.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a self-manufactured crisis. I mean, this is a self-inflicted political wound. Frankly, I don't know how they actually fix this, which
I
frankly
don't
should be a
either.
concern for everybody. It's not a political concern, right? Like
No.
if you're just a person here in the world, I don't care if you're Republican or a Democrat, if the inconsistency, if the reckless behavior, if the changing the tariff policy every 6 hours undergirds the real problem here, that there's no stability, there's no predictability, that it ruins business confidence and
Yeah.
consumer confidence, how does Trump even fix that now? Right? Like
I don't know.
once the economy effectively loses trust in the presumption of stability, how do you fix that without changing leadership? And we're at least 3.5 years away from a different administration, right?
Yeah, and I mean, one of the one of the sort of nightmare scenarios and why Trump stopped doing it probably is because of the bond market, right? That
Yep.
it became clear that our debt is not worth as much. By the way, FYI, China holds a lot of our debt.
Yep.
And China can dump it anytime they want. I mean, there is a real sense in which we have sort of backed into a trade war here that we can't win. And I don't think we can. And I want to talk about JD Vance for a minute because JD Vance said this comment. I'm going to read it to you. I don't think he understood what it meant. Here's what he said. And I think that this may have really fucked everything up. JD Vance's comment about Chinese peasants was taken in China as deeply offensive and is now a hurdle to trade talks. Trump administration's approach to appears tone deaf on this.
Well, I should ask, what did Vance exactly say about Chinese peasants?
Vance said, "We borrow money from Chinese peasants to buy the things those Chinese peasants manufacture."
There's such a different way to say that.
Like any other way.
Right, there's so many different ways to say that. And I think, look, I am somebody who thinks we have to have a different trade policy with China. Absolutely. The tariff-free trade with blanket across the board tariff-free trade with China has not really worked. But in changing that policy, we have to be cognizant of the fact that because we offshored so much production or allowed the offshoring, really encouraged the
Right.
offshoring of so much production to China, that they now have leverage over us in ways that critics of the China trade deal warned, right? That
Right.
China has production capacity that we don't. China has control over rare earth minerals that we physically do not have here in the
Right.
United States.
And in
So,
fact, they've threatened the rare earth
yes,
minerals. Yeah. Go on.
yes, China has production capacity on, as we discussed, microchips that power the whole economy. The idea that we can get into recklessly a trade war with China and not sustain real damage to our economy is frankly insane. But it's also not to say that, hey, we shouldn't change anything with our trade policy. The point is, because of the current, of the NAFTA era trade policies, we have weakened our leverage in
Hmm.
any trade war with China. And pretending that's not the case is a formula for disaster.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point, and I think that it definitely seems like you could see a world in which this China trade war is not easy to get out of and ends badly.
Absolutely. I think I look, I would say this. We have some leverage in the sense that China needs a strong consumer economy in the United
Right.
States, right? Like
Right.
we are connected in that way. So a trade war, it's not like a trade war doesn't hurt China. It's not like China doesn't need us. So the hope is that cooler heads will ultimately prevail. But right now, we're in the moment of like hope, hopefully this arrives at an equilibrium that's somewhat better than it was, because right now it seems not only unpredictable but headed in a really dangerous direction. And we haven't even talked about, I don't know, it's almost too apocalyptic to think about, but like the military implications of this, right? I mean, like
Right.
trade wars aren't throughout history haven't just been fought with like money and commerce. Like trade wars
Right.
sometimes become like wars.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.